He had built his world, brick by solitary brick under the vast, indifferent sky, his heart poised on the precipice of a promised future, a bride, a family, a legacy. But fate, a brutal sculptor, carved a different image into his waiting arms. 9 small shadows, pale and silent, emerged from the dust-choked horizon, shattering every expectation, every dream, replacing them with a stark, undeniable truth. He was no longer waiting for a love, but for a profound, terrifying responsibility. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. Kyle stood at the edge of his sprawling Comanche ranch, the wind a constant, low whisper against his skin, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. His eyes, keen and weathered by 1,000 sunrises, scanned the faint wagon track that snaked across the plains, anticipating a dust cloud, a distant silhouette that would signify her arrival. Akna, the woman promised to him, was due with the next trading caravan, bringing with her the promise of warmth, companionship, and the soft echo of children's laughter that his solitary stone house had long craved. He had spent weeks preparing, mending fences, clearing the spring, even carving a small, intricate wooden bird for her, a gesture of tenderness he rarely allowed himself. This land, vast and unforgiving, had always been his solace, his silent confidant, but even the strongest pine yearns for the embrace of the earth around its roots. His life had been a series of hard choices, of quiet battles fought within himself and against the encroaching tide of the outside world. Yet he believed, truly believed, that this union would finally bring a stillness to the storm within. The air was thick with expectation, a tangible hum in the oppressive afternoon heat. He saw it then, not the neat, disciplined caravan he expected, but a haphazard, broken-down wagon, its single horse stumbling, its canvas torn like a tattered flag of surrender. No outriders, no familiar faces, only silence. As the wagon drew closer, the silence became oppressive, a heavy blanket smothering the landscape. He squinted, his brow furrowing, a strange knot forming in his gut. The figure on the driver's bench was small, too small, a child. And behind, huddled in the wagon's hollowed belly, were others, 9 of them, white children. Their faces, gaunt and streaked with dirt, were stark white against the dark, sun-baked wood, their eyes wide, unblinking pools of terror and exhaustion. This was not the future he had anticipated. This was a riddle whispered by the wind, a sudden, brutal turn of the tide. The land, which had always felt like an extension of his own spirit, suddenly seemed alien, unforgiving, and burdened by a weight he could not yet comprehend. His bride was not coming. Instead, 9 fragile, abandoned echoes of a world he struggled to understand had arrived at his doorstep. What cruel jest was this? What intricate web of misfortune had woven its way to his solitary ranch? The silence of the plains was broken only by the creak of the wagon and the faint, ragged breathing of children who had clearly endured too much. He stood there, rooted, a statue carved from disbelief as their pale, uncertain faces lifted towards him, searching, perhaps, for salvation in the eyes of a man who felt nothing but a profound, chilling emptiness. The world had shifted, irrevocably. The wagon groaned to a halt, a final, weary sigh. The small driver, a boy no older than 10, slipped from the seat, his legs buckling, his gaze fixed on Kyle with a mixture of defiance and profound weariness. The others remained huddled, a pile of small, unmoving bodies like broken dolls. Kale, a man forged in the crucible of solitude, felt a strange paralysis grip him. These were not his people, not his kin. They were echoes of the very world that had, time and again, sought to diminish and displace his own. Yet, they were children, undeniably, tragically, just children. Their silence was deafening, more eloquent than any plea. Their gaunt faces, pale beneath layers of grime, spoke of hunger that gnawed at the bone, of thirst that cracked the lips, of a fear so deep it had settled into their very marrow. One little girl, perhaps 4 years old, slowly lifted a hand, a tiny skeletal gesture, before it fell back to her lap, as if the effort itself was too great. What unholy journey had brought them here, to the far reaches of the Comanche plains, to his remote ranch? The wind seemed to carry the ghost of their suffering, a mournful dirge across the vast, empty expanse. Cale's mind, accustomed to the stark logic of survival, grappled with the surreal tableau. His bride, his anticipated future, had been replaced by this desperate present. His fists clenched, a primal instinct to turn away, to reject this impossible burden. But the image of their vacant eyes, the haunted stillness of their forms, pierced through his resolve. A flicker, almost imperceptible, of something akin to pity, or perhaps a long-buried memory of his own childhood vulnerability, stirred within him. This was not a question of alliance or lineage. It was a fundamental question of humanity. Could he, a man who had seen much of the world's brutality, simply turn his back on these abandoned souls? The sun dipped lower, casting long, hungry shadows that seemed to devour the fragile forms in the wagon. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots the only sound in the vast silence. He could not leave them to the elements, to the scavengers of the night, to the slow, agonizing grip of starvation. His ranch, stark and unadorned, was not a haven, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it offered shelter, water, the meager comfort of 4 stone walls. His decision was not born of charity, nor even a profound sense of compassion in that moment, but from a grim, almost fatalistic acceptance. This was his new reality, thrust upon him by an unseen hand, a cruel twist of fate that resonated with an ancient, unspoken grief within his own heart. The boy in the wagon, the small driver, watched him, his gaze unblinking, expectant, reflecting the unasked question of all 9 children. What now? The first days were a raw, unyielding testament to deprivation. The children, beyond exhaustion, collapsed almost immediately, their small bodies a patchwork of bruises, insect bites, and the skeletal outlines of hunger. Kyle, a man used to the solitary rhythm of ranch life, moved through his house like a ghost in his own dwelling, his every step a stark reminder of the 9 quiet breaths now filling his home. He prepared simple meals, hardtack, dried venison, watered-down coffee, and watched them eat, not with the hearty appetite of growing children, but with the frantic, desperate efficiency of starved animals. Their silence was unsettling, broken only by the occasional cough or the soft murmur of a nightmare. They carried a profound, almost tangible fear, a shadow that clung to their slight frames even in the relative safety of his home. His initial grim acceptance slowly gave way to a grudging sense of responsibility. He found himself tending to their needs with a rough, unpracticed hand, washing their faces, binding their cuts, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle against their feverish skin. He saw the world through their eyes for the first time, a Comanche man, large and imposing, whose language was not their own, whose very presence was a stark deviation from anything they had known. His world, once predictable, had become a chaotic symphony of childish need and silent suffering. The eldest girl, perhaps 12, with eyes that held the wisdom of too much sorrow, watched him constantly, her gaze wary, assessing. He tried to speak to them. Simple words in English he remembered from traders, but they offered only blank stares or flinched away. Communication was a chasm, wide and deep. He remembered his own childhood, a fleeting image of his younger brother lost to the smallpox. The memory, a jagged shard of pain, surfaced unbidden, a stark reminder of the fragility of life, the brutal finality of loss. It was not pity that drove him, not entirely. It was a more complex, almost primal instinct, a refusal to witness the slow demise of children on his land, children who had already endured incomprehensible abandonment. He was a Comanche, a man of this land, and while their arrival was an unwelcome intrusion, it was also an undeniable presence, a stark challenge to his very being. The world outside, the scattered settlements, the distant towns, they would hear. News, like wind-borne seeds, traveled fast across the plains. A Comanche rancher, taking in white children. The very notion was a provocation, a breach of unseen boundaries, an open invitation for scrutiny, suspicion, and perhaps outright hostility. His solitude, once a fortress, now felt like a vulnerability. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was only the beginning of a far greater struggle, one that would test his spirit in ways he had never imagined. The news, predictable as the changing seasons, rippled across the plains and into the sparse, isolated settlements. Cale felt the shift in the wind, the subtle change in the gaze of the few white traders who occasionally ventured near his ranch. Their eyes, once merely cautious, now held a glint of suspicion, a mix of curiosity and thinly veiled contempt. He was no longer just a Comanche rancher, an anomaly tolerated for his honest trade. He was a peculiar, unsettling enigma, a man who had defied the unspoken rules of their fractured world. Rumors, insidious and sharp, began to circulate, whispers carried on the wind. He's keeping them for ransom. He's trying to turn them. He's gone mad. Each unfounded accusation chipped away at his hard-won peace, reinforcing the ingrained biases he had spent a lifetime navigating. One afternoon, a rider, a grim-faced settler known for his fiery sermons and even fierier prejudices, appeared at the edge of Cale's land. He didn't dismount, merely sat astride his horse, his eyes narrowed, his posture stiff with righteous indignation. "Heard you got some new mouths to feed, Cale," the settler called out, his voice sharp, laced with condescension. "White mouths. You best remember where they belong." Cale said nothing, his gaze unwavering, meeting the man's challenge with a silent, formidable resolve. The children, confined to the house, were unaware of this silent battle being waged for their very presence. Yet their subtle integration into the rhythms of his life had already begun. Slowly, awkwardly, he taught them to draw water, to feed the chickens, to split kindling. These were not lessons in grace, but in grim necessity, in the stark realities of survival on the plains. He found himself observing them, noting their individual traits: the eldest boy, silent and watchful; the smallest girl, who clung to a tattered rag doll; the spirited redhead, who, despite her ordeal, still possessed a spark of untamed energy. The weight of their existence pressed down on him, a constant, physical burden. His thoughts often drifted back to his own lost family, to the faces of his mother and father, his brother gone too soon. The smallpox had swept through his village years ago, a merciless wave of sickness that left a trail of desolation and a deep, unhealing wound in his soul. He'd been alone since, a solitary sentinel guarding his heritage, his land. Now, these children, these unexpected intruders, had inadvertently unearthed that buried pain, forcing him to confront the ghost of his own past vulnerability. He was Cale, a Comanche man, forged in fire and loss, and he knew the cruelty of the world intimately. Could he truly protect these fragile beings from the forces that sought to reclaim them, or worse, destroy them? The settler eventually rode off, his sneer a lasting imprint on the quiet afternoon. But Cale knew this was merely the first volley in a long, arduous campaign. Days bled into weeks, each sunrise bringing a new layer of dust to the plains and, subtly, a new texture to the silence within Cale's home. The children, though still marked by the trauma of their journey, began to emerge from their chrysalis of fear. Small, hesitant steps towards normalcy were taken. A giggle, soft and unexpected, from the youngest girl as Cale's hound, Bear, nuzzled her hand. A shy question from the eldest boy about the stars, which Cale, to his own surprise, found himself answering, pointing out constellations, weaving them into the fabric of ancient Comanche tales. He caught glimpses of their personalities, previously hidden beneath layers of grime and terror. There was Mary, the eldest, stoic and fiercely protective of the younger ones, her eyes often filled with an unspoken weariness that belied her years. There was Thomas, the quiet, observant boy who had driven the wagon, his hand surprisingly deft with the simple tools Cale offered. And then there was Lily, the redhead, a tiny whirlwind of restless energy who, despite the bleakness, found joy in a stray feather or a smooth river stone. Cale, a man of few words, found himself speaking more, not in grand pronouncements, but in practical instructions. In the quiet assurance of his presence, he showed them how to tend the small vegetable patch, how to care for the horses. These were not acts of charity, he told himself, but of necessity. They were here, they needed to learn to survive. Yet, in the quiet moments, when a small hand reached out for his, or when he heard their hesitant attempts at mimicking his Comanche words, a strange, unfamiliar warmth settled in his chest. It was not love, not yet, but something akin to the thawing of a long frozen river. He saw their past, their suffering, reflected in their wary eyes, and it resonated with a deep internal understanding of his own history, his own losses. He sometimes thought of Akna, his intended bride, and the image of her faded, replaced by the vivid, demanding reality of these 9 small lives. Was this his destiny now? To be a reluctant guardian to children not his own, children whose very existence was a constant reminder of the societal chasm that separated his world from theirs. A nagging question persisted, a dull ache beneath the surface of his daily routine. Who were these children truly? What life had they left behind? Or rather, what life had abandoned them? He had found no papers, no letters, no clues in the wagon. They spoke little, and when they did, it was in hushed, fragmented sentences about a great sickness and a long journey. An open loop, a gaping void in their story, continued to haunt him. He understood silence, knew its power, but this silence was different, heavy with untold tragedy, a secret that still lingered in the dust they had carried with them from a past they seemed eager to forget. The fragile peace that had settled over Cale's ranch was shattered one late afternoon by the distant sound of galloping hooves, too many for a lone rider. His instincts, honed by a lifetime on the unforgiving plains, screamed danger. He had seen the way the townspeople looked at him, the barely concealed animosity, and he knew that curiosity often curdled into accusation. He pulled the children inside the sturdy stone house, locking the heavy oak door, his hand already on the worn grip of his rifle. Through a narrow slit in the shutters, he watched as a small band of riders, perhaps 5 or 6, approached. They were not traders, nor were they lawmen. Their faces were hard, their movements aggressive, their purpose clear in the glint of the setting sun on their worn rifles. Leading them was a man Cale vaguely recognized from the nearest settlement, a grizzled, opportunistic rancher named Silas Vance, whose eyes held a predatory hunger for land and control. "Cale," Vance bellowed, his voice coarse, echoing across the silent yard. "We know you got 'em, the abandoned ones. Their kin are looking for 'em. Proper folk, not savages." The word hung in the air, a venomous dart aimed squarely at Cale's heart, a stark reminder of the chasm of prejudice that separated them. Inside, the children huddled together, their small faces pale with renewed fear, their eyes fixed on Cale. Seeking reassurance, he barely felt himself. He did not respond, allowing his silence to be his shield, his defiance. He had faced men like Vance before, men who saw only what they wanted to see, who measured worth by the color of skin and the accumulation of wealth. His mind raced, recalling a memory long buried, a raid on his people years ago by a rogue band of soldiers, not unlike these men in their intent. He had been a boy then, hidden in the brush, watching as his elders fought, as their spirits were broken. He remembered the cold fire in his belly, the desperate need to protect even then. It was a feeling that resurfaced now, primal and undeniable. He was no stranger to violence, had committed acts in his past that still haunted his waking hours, choices made in the brutal crucible of survival that stained his hands. This moral ambiguity, this blurred line between right and wrong, was a constant companion. He was not a saint. He was a survivor, molded by the harsh realities of a dying world. Vance continued his taunts, his threats, but Cale stood his ground, a lone sentinel against the encroaching tide. He had to protect these children, not just from the elements, but from the very men who claimed to represent civilization, who, in their twisted perception, saw him as the savage, and them as his rightful spoils. The tension stretched, thin and brittle, like a taut bowstring. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood and fire, a stark backdrop to the brewing storm. The chilling wind, no longer a whisper but a low moan, carried more than dust. It carried the lingering echoes of a past Cale had meticulously buried. Vance's words, "proper folk," struck a raw nerve, pulling at threads of memory, revealing a tapestry woven with violence and injustice. Cale's hands, calloused and strong, felt the phantom weight of a hatchet, the cold shock of blood, actions taken in the brutal haze of self-preservation that had forever altered the landscape of his soul. He had not always been the solitary rancher. There was a time, long before the stone house, before the methodical quiet of his current life, when he was simply Kyle, a young warrior, swift and fierce. The memory returned in fragments, sharp and piercing. A small skirmish, a misunderstanding escalated by fear and prejudice, with a group of white trappers who had encroached upon sacred hunting grounds. Words had failed, then fists, then knives. Kale, defending his kin, his territory, had acted with the desperate savagery born of a cornered animal. He had survived, but the encounter had left him with a bitter taste, a profound disillusionment with the simplistic notions of right and wrong. He had seen the same cold, unyielding resolve in his own eyes reflected in the eyes of his adversaries. The lines blurred. Morality became a shifting desert, defined not by abstract ideals, but by the stark necessities of survival. He remembered standing over one of them, a young man not much older than himself, a boy really whose terrified eyes held a flicker of understanding, a shared humanity, even as Kale's hand, driven by a desperate loyalty to his people, tightened around the weapon. This was the burden he carried, the core of his moral ambiguity. He had taken a life, not out of malice, but out of a desperate, primal need to protect what was left of his world. And it had left an indelible mark, a permanent shadow that followed him even into the sun-drenched solitude of his ranch. This experience, this deep-seated knowledge of humanity's capacity for both good and terrible acts, was what made him wary, guarded, yet also uniquely suited to understand the complex suffering of the children now huddled in his home. He knew the desperation that could drive people to unthinkable acts, knew the chilling silence that followed profound loss. He saw in their pale, bewildered faces not just a demand for shelter, but an unspoken plea for understanding, for a haven from the very brutality he himself had witnessed, and in his own way, participated in. He had sought to escape that past, to build a new life rooted in peace, but it seemed fate, or perhaps simply the relentless cycle of human conflict, had brought the past back to his doorstep in the form of these 9 fragile, vulnerable lives. He looked at Mary, the eldest girl, her small face etched with a wisdom beyond her years, and saw a reflection of that same desperate resilience he had once known. He was a survivor, and now, by a twist of cruel irony, he was responsible for ensuring the survival of others who were, in so many ways, the very antithesis of his own world, yet undeniably human. The air inside the small stone house was thick with unspoken questions, a quiet hum beneath the mundane sounds of children learning to live again. Kyle, ever vigilant, sensed a subtle shift in Mary, the eldest girl. Her initial wariness, a shield she had worn so stoically, began to crack, revealing glimpses of a deeper, more profound sorrow. One evening, as the last embers of the fire flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, Mary approached Kale, her steps hesitant. "Our mama. She was sick," she whispered, her voice a thin, reedy sound, barely audible above the wind's mournful song outside. "The cough, it wouldn't stop." Kyle nodded, his eyes fixed on her small, trembling form. He had seen the sickness before, had lost many of his own to it. The great sickness, as they called it, the white man's plague. "Papa, he left to find help," she continued, her voice catching. "He said he'd be back. He promised. But the cough got worse, and Mama," she went quiet. "And then the men came." Her words were a torrent now, released from a dam of unspoken grief. "Not good men. They took some things. Said we were just extra mouths. Told Thomas to drive. Just drive. To anywhere." A shudder ran through her small frame. They said we were cursed." The mystery, shrouded in silence and fear, began to unravel, exposing a cruel truth. Not merely abandonment, but a callous disregard, a brutal act of disposal. The men were not lawmen nor concerned neighbors. They were opportunistic vultures preying on the weak, seeing the children as mere obstacles, worthless burdens to be shed. A wave of cold fury washed over Kyle. This was the ugly face of humanity, the darker side of a world that preached civilization, yet practiced barbarity. His own people had suffered similar fates, at the hands of those who deemed them less than human. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. He looked at the other children, their innocent faces unaware of the full depravity of their abandonment. Was this the proper folk Vance spoke of? A new thread of suspense tightened around Cale's heart. These children were not just orphaned. They were discarded, cast adrift by a society that preferred convenience over compassion. And now these same cruelties were circling, closer than ever. He remembered the glint in Vance's eyes, the way he had spoken of proper folk and their kin. Was Vance merely a bigot, or was there more to his sudden appearance, his aggressive demands? Was he somehow connected to these men who had abandoned the children, perhaps even one of them? A new open loop, far more sinister than the last, had just unfurled before him. He had taken them in, offering them a fragile sanctuary, but now he knew their story was not just one of survival, but of escape from a truly malevolent force. The full weight of his responsibility, now deepened by this revelation, pressed upon him. He was not just providing food and shelter, he was protecting them from the very people who had cast them out, and who might, by some cruel twist of fate, seek to reclaim them for their own twisted ends. The fight was no longer just about prejudice, it was about outright evil. The standoff escalated, the air crackling with a palpable tension. Vance, frustrated by Cale's impenetrable silence, decided to push. "You don't understand, Cale," he sneered, dismounting, his hand hovering over the pistol at his hip. "These ain't just stray pups. There's a reward out, a considerable sum, for their return. Some influential folk are mighty keen on keeping this whole affair quiet, if you catch my drift. Don't want no bad names spreadin' round." His eyes narrowed, predatory. "You hand 'em over, Kyle, and you can keep your ranch, keep your skin. Otherwise, things could get complicated." The revelation hung in the air, cold and hard. A reward, a cover-up. This wasn't about rescuing lost children. It was about controlling a narrative, silencing a potential scandal, and retrieving human collateral. Cale's blood ran cold. The men who had abandoned them, the influential folk, they were not merely callous but calculating. His own moral compass, already fluid, spun wildly in this new, murky landscape. He looked out through the narrow shutter, his gaze sweeping over the grim faces of Vance's men. They were not looking for justice. They were looking for profit, for a piece of the silence. Inside, the sound of a child's muffled cough, Lily's reached him. His grip on the rifle tightened, knuckles white. He was alone, outnumbered, defending children who were not his own, against men who wielded both law and violence as their tools. He had faced impossible odds before, made choices that haunted him still. The memory of the skirmish, the desperate act of self-preservation, flashed before his eyes. He had known then that there were moments when survival demanded a brutal, uncompromising response. This was such a moment. Vance took another step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Last chance, savage. Give 'em up." Cale moved then, not with explosive speed, but with a deliberate, lethal grace. The rifle lifted, the cold steel a familiar extension of his will. He did not aim to kill, not yet, but to disable, to warn. A shot cracked, precise and sharp, tearing through the brim of Vance's hat, sending splinters of felt and wood into the air, narrowly missing his temple. Vance froze, his face draining of color, a stunned disbelief replacing his arrogance. His men flinched, some instinctively reaching for their weapons, but Cale's stance, his unblinking gaze, held them rooted. The silent house, the children huddled within, became a fortress, guarded by a man who had chosen his side, irrevocably. "They stay," Kyle's voice cut through the stillness, low and resonant, carrying the weight of his ancestors, the raw power of a man pushed to his breaking point. "They are no longer lost. They are here, and here, they are safe." The words were not a plea, but a declaration, a stark challenge thrown into the face of a hostile world. The line was drawn, indelible, between the brutal indifference of those outside and the hard-won, defiant sanctuary within. The echo of the rifle shot reverberated not just across the plains, but within the stone walls of Cale's home, a stark punctuation mark on the day's brutal declaration. Vance and his men, rattled but not broken, retreated, their humiliation a bitter taste on the wind. Kyle watched them disappear into the gathering twilight, knowing this was merely a temporary reprieve, a battle won, but the war far from over. He turned, the heavy rifle still in his hands, to face the small, trembling cluster of children. Their eyes, wide with fear and something akin to awe, were fixed on him. Mary, ever the silent observer, now looked at him with a newfound understanding, a dawning realization that this man, this formidable, enigmatic Comanche, had just risked everything for them. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving Cale with a profound weariness that settled deep into his bones. He was not a hero, not in any conventional sense. He was a man who had made a choice, a hard, almost instinctual decision born from a lifetime of facing injustice and protecting what little he had left. The act itself, the calculated violence, felt familiar, almost comforting in its stark simplicity, yet it also carried the heavy weight of consequence. He thought of the young trapper, the moment he had crossed a line in the name of survival, and recognized the same chilling resolve in his own actions moments ago. The line between protector and aggressor had always been thin for him, a moral tightrope walked in the face of a world that offered few easy answers. He had chosen to defend these children, not out of a sudden surge of paternal affection, but because their vulnerable presence had somehow ignited a dormant spark within him, a flicker of his own humanity that he had long believed extinguished. They were symbols of a greater conflict, caught in the crossfire of prejudice, greed, and the unforgiving expansion of one culture over another. His ranch, once a solitary refuge, was now a beacon, a defiant outpost, and he, its reluctant guardian, was tethered to a fate he had never sought. He put the rifle down, its cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth that now, subtly, tentatively, began to fill his home. The children, sensing the immediate danger had passed, slowly relaxed. Lily, the youngest, timidly approached him, her small hand reaching out to touch the rough fabric of his trousers. Kyle looked down, meeting her gaze, and in her innocent eyes he saw not just fear, but a dawning sense of trust, a fragile, unspoken gratitude. It was a burden, yes, a monumental one, but also, perhaps, a strange, unexpected purpose. The silence that filled the house was no longer one of fear or absence, but one of shared breath, of fragile beginnings, of a profound, unspoken commitment forged in the crucible of conflict. He was no longer just waiting. He was building slowly, painstakingly, a new kind of future, brick by weary brick, under the vast, indifferent sky. The days that followed the confrontation settled into a new, quiet rhythm, a fragile peace, earned through defiance. Vance and his men did not return immediately, but Cale knew their retreat was tactical, not conclusive. The threat lingered, a dark cloud on the horizon, but for now, life at the ranch had shifted. The children, witnessing Kyle's unwavering resolve, shed the last vestiges of their profound fear. They moved with a newfound ease, their laughter, once a foreign sound, now echoing through the stone house, tentative at first, then growing bolder, filling the space with a vibrancy it had never known. Mary took on the role of a quiet matriarch, assisting Cale with the younger ones, her gaze still watchful, but now filled with an unspoken respect. Thomas, the silent wagon driver, began to shadow Kyle, observing his work with the horses, listening intently as Kyle spoke of the land, its subtle signs, its ancient wisdom. Even Lily, the vivacious redhead, seemed to ground herself, finding solace in the quiet routines of feeding the chickens and gathering eggs. Cale, observing them, felt a subtle shift within himself. The anger, the initial resentment at their intrusion, slowly began to recede, replaced by a complex blend of responsibility, a burgeoning protectiveness, and even, surprisingly, moments of a deep, unbidden affection. He found himself teaching them the practicalities of his world, how to identify edible plants, how to track small game, the importance of water. He spoke to them in simple Comanche words, and to his surprise, they began to mimic him, their accents charmingly mismatched. He watched them learn, watched them grow, their resilience a testament to the human spirit's capacity for renewal. Yet the past was not forgotten. He would sit by the fire at night, the children asleep in their makeshift beds, and his mind would drift to Akna, his promised bride. Her image, once so vivid, had blurred, replaced by the demanding, vibrant reality of these 9 small lives. What would she have thought of this chaotic, unexpected family? Would she have understood the choices he had made, the lines he had crossed? He was a man deeply flawed, his hands marked by the choices made in moments of desperation. his heart guarded by years of solitude and loss. He had taken them in, not as an act of pure altruism, but as a complex response to a cruel fate. He had defied the norms of his own people and the prejudices of the white settlers, all for a group of children who were, by all accounts, an impossible burden. But looking at their sleeping faces, illuminated by the soft glow of the firelight, he knew he had made the right choice, the only choice. The resolution was not a grand triumph, but a quiet acceptance, a hard-won peace forged in the crucible of his own moral ambiguity. This ranch, once a solitary fortress, was slowly, painstakingly becoming a home, defined not by blood but by resilience, by shared hardship, and by the fragile, enduring bonds of unlikely kinship. The sun, a fiery sentinel, rose each morning over Cale's ranch, painting the vast plains in hues of amber and gold, illuminating a future that against all odds seemed to hold a quiet, steadfast promise. The children, once shadows of trauma, now moved with the easy confidence of those who had found their footing, their laughter a melody carried on the wind. Mary had blossomed into a capable young woman, her watchful eyes now reflecting not fear, but a burgeoning strength. She helped Cale manage the household, her small hands surprisingly efficient, her quiet presence a steady anchor. Thomas, the silent boy, had become Cale's shadow, learning the ways of the ranch, absorbing Cale's knowledge of the land and its creatures with an insatiable hunger. He was already showing signs of a future rancher, his hands calloused, his gaze as keen as Cale's. Even Lily, the youngest, no longer clung to her tattered doll, but explored the yard with boundless curiosity, her red hair a bright spark against the dusty landscape. Their voices, speaking a blend of hesitant English and increasingly fluent Comanche, wove a new language into the fabric of Kyle's solitary life. He taught them to ride, to hunt, to understand the subtle rhythms of the plains. He shared stories of his people, their traditions, their deep connection to the land, finding a quiet pride in their rapt attention. They were not Comanche by blood, yet they were learning to live like plains people, adapting, thriving, forging an identity that transcended the simple lines of race and origin. Vance and his ilk had not returned. The fear of confrontation had faded, replaced by the enduring reality of daily life, of sunrise and sunset, of growing crops and tending livestock. Cale had built not just a sanctuary, but a family, one born not of expectation or lineage, but of necessity, resilience, and a profound, reluctant act of human compassion. He still carried the weight of his past, the moral ambiguities, the echoes of violence that had shaped him, but now those shadows were softened by the light of 9 young souls, their trust a balm to his wounded spirit. The ranch, once a monument to his solitude, was now a vibrant testament to an unexpected future, a testament to the enduring power of connection in a fractured world. The vast sky, once indifferent, now seemed to watch over them with a gentle gaze. His heart, once poised for a singular love, had found its expanse in the collective beating of many, an intricate tapestry woven from broken threads, now mended, stronger, and more beautiful than he could have ever imagined. The Comanche rancher, who had waited for his bride, had found something else instead. A home, a purpose, a family, forged in the crucible of abandonment and defiance, stretching out, full of hard-won hope, into the boundless horizon.